So before we do get into the kind of philosophy of it, well, I wanted to ask you something that might be more of a political question, I guess, which is, can we just not dismiss post-liberalism on merely political terms, just see them as a reactionary movement, just say, well, liberalism has just created a world that certain conservative religious types just don't really like. There are lots of things about it they don't like. They don't like, gay rights and premarital sex and the decline of religious practice and multiculturalism and all sorts of things like that. And they're just sort of hearkening back to the good old days for people like them. So I guess I'm asking, why should we take them seriously as an intellectual movement, not just dismiss them as reactionary?
Okay, well, thank you, Alexis, for inviting me to give this talk about my forthcoming book. Um, I mean, I suppose your question takes me to why I did this in the first place. Um, there are sort of two reasons. One, I'm kind of interested in the ways in which a broadly liberal political philosophy comes under attack in the contemporary world, and that's both politically and intellectually. But I also see the rise of this movement and its self-identification. So one question is, well, what is it actually? But I
Mm.
also see the rise of this movement much more central to politics than, just a sort of general, socially conservative reaction to, the modern West and the liberal democracies are going to hell in a handcart, and we always thought this was going to happen, and this is just a sort of continuing, sort of small but vocal faction. Why this has been foregrounded, of course, is interesting. So I think one of the fundamental issues is the way it's been taken up by figures close to the MAGA movement. So the obvious person is J D Vance. But also social media has an impact on this in terms of its sort of acceleration and expansion of what were, always relatively fringe ideas,
Mm.
which now have a sort of resonance that it kind of needs explaining, or at least needs further attention, because it is close to power.
Yeah. So not just a fridge kind of intellectual movement anymore, but something that actually is influencing
Yeah.
policy, as I think we mentioned in the blurb. Like, the world has changed quite a lot since Trump's um, inauguration, second inauguration, and a lot of it has to do with policies that are informed by this political movement.
Yeah.
So I know definitions are very difficult, and of course, part of what we're trying to do today is understand what this kind of post-liberal movement is. But you start by saying something interesting. You say post-liberalism should not be just understood as like one of a variety of options of political philosophy, but it's a sort of negative ideology, and it sort of goes hand in hand with liberalism. And you have this metaphor which I really like. You say it's sort of like what antimatter is to matter. So what do you mean by that, and how do we understand post-liberalism as a negative ideology?
Okay, let me try and unpack that a bit. So I think the first point was, I couldn't really just call it anti-liberalism because, there's lots of anti-liberalism out there from,
Mm.
Marxist communism through various centrisms through to, the whole conservative tradition. So if you're looking at anti-liberalism, then you're probably covering one, a narrower conception of what liberalism actually is as a political ideology, and then lots of competitors for that ideological space. And I don't think that is really what's at stake here. Now, I don't know that everybody who buys into or falls under the influence of the post-liberal movement necessarily understands that. So it's attractive to many on the right because they didn't like liberalism anyway, but they mean something very specific politically about liberal.
Mm.
They dislike certain liberal values and so on and so forth. But the way in which post-liberalism, at least amongst the theorists, pitches itself is it takes liberalism to be an overarching doctrine, a big philosophy, which for many of them perhaps we'll come on to this a bit later on, for many of them, encompasses, much of contemporary conservatism,
Mm.
particularly the way in which it's been colonized by or overtaken by, or maybe it was always connected to what we now call neoliberalism. Figures like Hayek, even Michael Oakeshott, in some sense are actually liberals. Um, Roger Scruton, another very important English conservative philosopher, says that conservatism kind of accepts the fundamental Lockean settlement of popular sovereignty, limited government, and so on. So conservatism falls within a broadly liberal perspective. And I think that's the bit that the post-liberals really target. And the more theoretically informed, the more interesting figures want to challenge that philosophical liberalism because it makes it very difficult to articulate an alternative or a stable conservative politics, particularly if that's traditionalist, if
Mm.
it's connected to things like, objective truth, timeless values, the sort of things that religious conservatisms like, but it's not peculiar to those views. So that's the target. And therefore the real challenge of the post-liberals is to dispense with that philosophical perspective so that something new can be put in its place. They don't just want an alternative, a new conservatism or a more socially conservative but economically radical social democracy. Maybe that's what people like John Milbank and Adrian Pabst are after, maybe Blue Labour too. But they actually want to clear away this whole structure, which kind of, well, in their view, advantages, liberal answers to the fundamental challenge of modernity.
Mm.
So in that sense, they have to get rid of it. It's about displacing it, cancelling it out, if you like, and then something new can come up. So that's kind of what I'm trying to capture. And just one last bit on that, that is actually the sort of thing that Patrick Deneen identifies in his book, Why Liberalism Failed. Liberalism undermines itself, it's dangerous, it destroys everything, and it has to be replaced, removed, and we have to think beyond it.
Mm. So
How
you've
they do
touched on
it.
a number of
Yeah.
interesting points there, and it brings me to some of the next questions in our discussion. But a sort of feature of post-liberalism seems that it doesn't quite fit into the political spectrum that we have. So it's not obviously a sort of right-wing movement. It's not obviously a left-wing movement. It has representatives on both sides of the spectrum. And as you said, post-liberalism seems to reject what most of us, I think, take to be a sort of the default conservative politics of Thatcher, Reagan, the kind of neoliberalism on steroids and kind of small state and let the market run free. So can you speak a little bit to that sort of right-wing or post-liberal right-wing critique of neoliberalism, which kind of comes
Yeah.
as a surprise, and in your book you mentioned this one of the authors, Sohrab Ahmari, who has a book that criticizes corporate power as a form
Mm.
of tyranny and having led to a form of enslavement, which is quite a surprising critique coming from the right. So how do we make sense of the kind of political identity of post-liberalism here?
Right. So I think the fundamental bit that all post-liberals focus on is the sort of thin metaphysics that they think this liberal worldview depends on, which is one that gives primacy or attaches primacy to this idea of personal autonomy. Okay. Now, at some level, you see that. I mean, it's most stark. You see it in the ideas of Ayn Rand, an anarchism, So hardcore libertarians think it's all about the self and the world that the self can make. And that's highly individualistic. Now, a more sophisticated variant of that you see in the sort of neoliberalism of Hayek and so on, the primacy of the individual versus, the social democratic or nanny state, which is compensating for the failures of markets and so on. So there's this challenge of libertarianism, how this impacts on conservative theories, conservative ways of thinking, conservatism. Well, particularly in the United States, you're starting to see on the political right a turn away from neoliberalism. And your example of Sohrab Ahmari is a very good one. So he's just published this book, Tyranny Inc., which is a sort of critique of the neoliberal conception of law that underpins, well, certainly the choices of the Federalist Society of a number of the more recent Supreme Court hires. Neil Gorsuch in particular, but Kavanaugh and so on are all. So they use law as a way of advantaging or getting out of the way of business, advancing the state. And Amari's kind of saying, well, hang on, whilst we're all in favor of, a more sort of conservative approach to constitutional adjudication, this is a way of advancing a profoundly individualistic, libertarian approach to politics, which is inconsistent with supporting the family and intermediate institutions and work-life balance and just. And Amari goes through this stage by stage in a wonderful book because it's all based on cases, which is a sort of pushback to American conservatism that they're not being truly conservative. So I think that's the way this works in the conservative discourse in the United States. And this is the sort of thing that's picked up by Vance in his policy agenda. Whether this is quite what we're going to see through Trump and MAGA, I leave that to one side because it's a political point, not a philosophical one, and predicting what's going to happen with Trump is a mug's game anyway. But it's why a conservative view, which wants to separate itself from, the desiccating effect of market-driven society, the sort of, view that's attributed to Thatcher, although she never said anything quite so crass, that there are only, there's only individuals. There's no such thing as society. There's just individuals and their families. They're trying to come back and say, well, there is something about society. Society is about order. Good order is essential. It's essential for making individuals and their genuine rights with obligations. So it is a struggle on the political right for the soul of a future conservatism.
But at the same time, as you point out, I mean, especially in the United Kingdom, I don't know if that's true of the United States or other countries, but there are also representatives from the left making quite similar arguments and sometimes kind of conservative sounding arguments, again, arguing that, well, post-liberalism has destroyed community, it's undermined kind of the role that church and working men's clubs and labor unions and all these kind of things that created a sort of more cohesive society in the past, and that neoliberalism has kind of come and trashed that. And maybe we'd expect the argument about unions and maybe arguments about the immiseration of people and sort of maybe more economic argument. But there's also this kind of social argument, again, coming from the left that can sound a bit conservative, but that's where the two sort of sides of the spectrum meet and have common ground when it comes to their critique here.
Yeah. So on the left in the UK, you have the Blue Labour movement that's most publicly associated with Maurice Glassman, Lord Glassman, but actually, interestingly, with Morgan McSweeney, who's the whiz who was behind Labour's sort of election victory in the past. And then perhaps I think a more interesting thinker, somebody like John Cruddas, who was a policy advisor, director for Tony Blair, has always been, on a trajectory that is, for his background reasons, but on a trajectory that's different to that globalist third way conception of politics. Now, one of the things that Cruddas is on about precisely is recovering this communitarian tradition within the left, okay, an ethical socialism, and contrasting it with our own dear LSE's web style Fabian socialism, which is, connected with beverage and welfarism. And his point here is about political relationships, it's about hierarchy, it's about what is the task of, socialism, social democracy. Is it giving more stuff to people? So welfare recipients, giving them more cash? Is it about transfer payments, simply, structuring the transfer of resources from the rich to the poor? Or is it about building dignity, and the other things that are the social bases of self-respect? It's not that Cruddas doesn't think that some level of equality is important, but the focus is wrong. And then the other element is a kind of reaction against the new left with its preoccupation with identity politics, which you see in, some aspects of multiculturalism and so on, where the real, egalitarian project is about recognizing denied identities and equalizing those. The old ethical socialists are still interested in class, in work, in labor, in the dignity of it, and so on. And that's undermined by thinking about, basic income, people don't have to work. Maybe, we should just, tax the rich enough or corporations enough and give everybody basic income and they do whatever they want. These thinkers think that's another kind of libertarian individualism. It is. Some of the more sophisticated thinkers there think it is. But they're challenging this idea that it's all about individuals and satisfying their wants rather than something that's more ethical, that's about cultivating a dignity and an identity and so on.
Yeah, now we're getting a little bit to the kind of philosophical crux of the sort of at the core of post-liberalism. And just to say, like you try and map three aspects of it, of post-liberalism. You say the three faces to it, echoing kind of John Gray's kind of two faces of liberalism. That's supposed to be a backhanded compliment, as it were. But so national populism, which I think a lot of us are quite familiar with, it's the prism through we've tried to understand a lot of movements like Trump in the recent past, and a critique of neoliberalism is part of that. But then the two other faces are common good communitarianism and then common good absolutism. And that's, I think, where there's a sort of like really meaty disagreement between liberalism and post-liberalism. And common good communitarianism sort of, to me, as at least echoes an old kind of argument between liberalism and communitarianism, and whether, it's the individual that has priority and the foundation of a political community and political thought, or whether it's the community that comes first and certain values that are attached to that, and then from there we sort of build everything else. I guess I'll ask you that then. Do you think this is in some ways just rehashing this kind of older philosophical debate, but in more urgent and politically real terms now?
In one sense, yes. I mean, in one sense, there are no new ideas under the sun. We sort of recycle these things and they come back, the salience of them come back in different contexts. Part of what drove this characterization, when I started out as a young academic late in my and also late in my philosophical education, the liberal communitarian debate was coming to the fore as people reacted to Rawls, and you had people like Sandel and Charles Taylor and Alistair and so on. And, what was that debate? And in the academy, the liberals sort of won over the communitarians, but they never really win. because ultimately, the communitarian vision, is as old as Aristotle. Modern version probably certainly as old as Hegel. And they come back for a reason. And one of the problems that they address is the fundamental challenge of justifying, the core values of liberalism. And liberalism tends to try and do this with some kind of abstraction and separating out some fundamental basis for justifying individual rights and so on. And communitarians have the very strong, response to that is you can't make sense of rights in the abstract. It's the first part of Hegel's Elements of the Philosophy of Right, the critique of abstract right, Kant, and then his sort of replacement of that with ethical society, out of which you can then make coherent sets of rights, obligations, relationships, and so on, but which then bring institutional structures and so on. So we're going back to that debate, and it's a fundamental philosophical one. What is at stake between the liberals and the communitarians? What's at stake between, a liberal individualist perspective and the sort of philosophical basis for that, or the challenge or opposition to it? So some of that, is sort of the familiar experience. But I see this now having a more political salience, and many of the post-liberal commentators or theorists really draw this common good idea out of that, broader philosophical tradition and say that's what the modern world is lacking. That's what politics is lacking. It's trying to do, political theory without a conception of the common good. So the debate has to be about the common good. Now, it's not easy to say what it is, but that's the terrain of debate, not terrain of rights. That will come next.
So I have a question about the common good and how it relates to liberalism.
Yeah.
So my question always was when I was reading rules and come across some of these critiques, or at least the way that liberals and political philosophers that espouse that space would present this theory as a sort of neutral political theory, one that didn't really espouse any kind of theory of the good. So I guess my question is both, is that critique fair? Is it fair to say liberalism doesn't have a conception of the common good? It's only concerned with the individual, given that liberalism is concerned with justice. It's concerned with social relations at a much kind of broader scale than just one-to-one interactions of the individual against the state. So is it really true that liberalism is only concerned with personal autonomy and doesn't have space for a kind of common good?
Well, I mean, I suppose my answer is no. Liberalism does have a space for a conception of the good, but it's a liberal conception of the good, and that seems to be cheating. But what do I mean by that? I suppose I mean the recognition of contemporary liberalism that appeals to the common good run up against the problem of pluralism, right? And this kind of connects the common good communitarianism with the absolutists. We might talk about that in a minute. But if you think about the common good, one can think of this as a way of conceiving politics in a particular place amongst a particular people who recognize a sort of way of doing things. That's Aristotle's view of the polis, but we don't live in a polis anymore. We live in a world in which lots of people have a conception of the good, religious, political, ethical, personal, and each of those conflict with the others. So if we appeal to the common good to solve the question one way or another, well, not solve the question, but to give us a way of dealing with difficult questions about accommodation, right? Should there be a right to a civil or political right to access to abortion for women, right? maybe we're not going to make that in terms of that argument, in terms of the truth or otherwise of these, but we're going to make a decision. How do we do that? Because these different conceptions of the good conflict. So I suppose what the Rawlsians or the political liberals say is we need some framework for managing that disagreement. So it can't just be a conception of the good because we don't know what the good is, the definite article, right? Whereas actually most people don't just think they have a conception of the good, they think their fundamental values are correct, the right ones. It would be kind of nice if other people shared them. Now, maybe most of us don't think we should therefore punish those who don't share those values, but we do think they have a claim. And some people are stupid, some people are lazy, some people just haven't given time to working it out. But if they did, they'd come round to seeing that kind of my way of doing things is the correct one. We all do something of that. But in politics, the stakes are more dangerous and the stakes are higher. So liberalism has a model of the good which mediates pluralism and the irreducibility of pluralism in modern democratic societies. And it seems to me, they confront us with a choice. There's lots of ways of dealing with diversity, disagreement, difference. You can acknowledge it, you can accommodate it as best as possible, you can force convergence on a single view. So it's how you think of coercion in relation to those questions about disagreement and the good. So liberalism does have a kind of vision, but it's one that seeks at least to, or in its own terms, it seeks to accommodate this difference and diversity, the fact of pluralism.
Mm.
Rawls has that, Berlin, all the important modern liberals.
Yeah, yeah. So liberalism basically sees, I mean, conception of the good is such a sort of weird term as well in
Yeah,
sort of political philosophy. But people believe different things are right, or that the state should
yeah,
be doing different things.
yeah,
People have these disagreements, so the question
yeah,
arises: okay, how do we mediate all these decisions?
yeah,
And liberalism's answer is in some ways, well, we need to respect the pluralism as much as
yeah,
possible in some way, and
yeah,
we have to make the state as neutral as possible, if not completely neutral, because
yeah,
that wouldn't be possible. So we have to, as much as possible, respect all these different ideas.
yeah.
And in some way, communitarianism, and we'll come to that in a minute,
Mm.
says, that's not the way it should be. We should all espouse kind of one version of whatever this kind of conception of the good is.
Well, yes and no. So some of the more sophisticated communitarians, I mean, I would think of, Charles Taylor, but
Mm,
possibly Alistair MacIntyre, even though before he, made his peace with Rome, always thought that some sort of political resolution to the conflict of values was going to leave things sort of contested.
mm,
So in some respects, they have a sort of liberal landing ground. What they want to say, though, is yes, what we don't believe is that the single conception of the good is the autonomy of the person. They don't believe in a
right.
metaphysics of autonomy. They're
Okay.
against Kant for a way of simplifying this. But the outcome is going to be some kind of messy trade-offs, political trade-offs about what you do when the conceptions of the good confront each other, which is the philosophical challenge of modernity. We can't be like Aristotle. We
Mm.
can't be like, medieval Christianity.
And is that just because our societies have become more complex and bigger and more complicated than the sort of homogeneous or semi-homogeneous societies of the Athenian polis? Although one has to question whether even, the Athenians lived in Aristotle's polis, because, there were
Yeah,
slaves that, maybe if they
yeah,
had a political voice, wouldn't necessarily agree with the conception of the good that
yeah.
Aristotle espoused.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. So the world of the citizen of the polis is a very small subset. There's no women. There's a huge slave class. Etc. All of that's taken. Um, I think. All right. Let me let me be careful how I respond to this. So the challenge that liberals address is the philosophical implications of modernity. Why are we in a world that is secularized, that is pluralistic, that is more individualistic? And of course, we can tell lots of stories about that. You know, if it's a Marxist story, you've got a kind of technological account of progress of history. You might have, you know, other kinds of historical, grand historical meta-narratives. You may even have a religious one. And somebody like Taylor is quite good at that because, of course, he's written on Hegel. He is a Catholic. He's of the left. He's of broadly liberal accommodationist values. You know, he's Canadian. You know, all Canadians are like that. So he's got a conception of the good. He's got an account of the challenge of modernity, and he thinks that somehow or other, you know, this is the framework in which the possible political moves we can have theoretically and but practically work themselves out. And I think, you know, the fundamental sort of perspective of somebody like Rawls is that if we think we've got to answer that fundamental question about the logic of history or the nature of value before we do political theory, we're never going to do any political theory. So one of the ambitions in his early work is to try and give us a way of doing some fairly high level political thinking about values that don't involve us resolving possibly irresolvable questions about the nature of the good life, the point of human existence, is there a God, you know, what is the structure of historical development and change. So it's to sort of step us, you know, get us to step back from, you know, metaphysics all the time, you know, in which case, you know, the only philosophy would be Wittgenstein kind of stuff, and see if there's something else to be said. Now, of course, the answer might be no, right? One of the things that the Rawlsians and the liberals set out, you know, is to have this kind of accommodationist agenda. I mean, still a question, you know, is it plausible? Is it self-sustaining? You know, the third chapter of Theory of Justice that nobody ever reads is about the problem of stability. You know, how can a liberal order sustain itself over time? You know, create the conditions of compliance and support that are necessary. You know, the answer is open. I'm not pretending that he's answered this satisfactorily or I've answered it satisfactorily and that's the end of the story.
Yeah.
But he's telling us that that's the, you know, the problem is about modernity, pluralism. And if all you can say is, well, modernity's wrong, and, you know, there are post-liberals who say that, it's all an error, and we have to go back to a world in which there is a candidate theory of order, you know, that's a pretty tough political ask.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but that does bring us to that third phase of post-liberalism, common good absolutism. And so a lot of these kind of current proponents of communitarian thought, like Patrick Deneen, are not quite as gracious as Charles Taylor and his sort of like Canadian Hegelianism. And they do sound a lot like saying, well, we've got the answers to these questions about what is the good, and we're going to order the state according to these values, and we're going to do it just because we can, and we don't need to justify why we're doing this to anyone. So, I mean, that does sound quite authoritarian and kind of like slightly terrifyingly theocratic, like we're going back to a state where a particular kind of religious view of the world, and we haven't touched upon this, maybe we can in a second, about the fact that a lot of these thinkers have a sort of Catholic influence through Catholic social thought and Catholic philosophy. Is there more sophistication to their view other than I know the truth and I will find ways to impose it on you?
Well, yes, I mean, you know, that partly is the position. And then you think, well, you know, where did they get this? Is it just an overhanging of an old world order and all this? I mean, there are theorists out there. I mean, I think somebody who looms quite large, you know, on the horizon of this is Carl Schmitt. And of course, Schmitt is also thinking through this consequence of, you know, the challenge of political nihilism. a world without value, how do we negotiate that? Does anything go? And one answer could be just that. It's just pure act of will. But Schmitt is a much more subtle and sophisticated thinker in the way in which we bring together the pre-rational basis of order. Now, he has a black reputation. He's a Nazi, not a terribly successful Nazi as it turned out, but failed denazification. And but if you look at somebody like Jürgen Habermas and his most recent, the quite incredible 3-volume history of the Western tradition, he kind of starts out there saying, I've spent my entire career challenging the legacy of Schmitt and where that ends up, sort of existential, authoritarian acts of will. That's the fundamental basis of politics, decisionism, dictatorship, and so on. All of the things that some on the post-liberal right in the United States are now looking at. What you need is a strong Caesarist dictator who's not just making stuff up, but he's deciding on the basis of the truth how we should proceed, not doing the liberal negotiation, consensus, seeking reasonable agreement. We've already got reason. We know what the truth is. The point is, what do you do with it? And if, trying to be liberal leads us to hell in a handcart, trans rights, shared toilet, all the sort of low-level things that really irritate a certain kind of social conservative, rather than accommodating all of these things, no, there's a right here, and the state's going to damn well choose that and impose it. And what's wrong with that? Well, we don't know the truth. Oh, yes, we do. They would say, maybe you just don't understand it. So there is a sort of authoritarianism that comes from thinking of the common good, thinking about, what is the nature of political authority and what's the task of what it is we ask politics and law to do.
And this sort of points to another kind of fundamental philosophical disagreement or rejection of liberalism, which is social contract theory, right? That sort of the state and society kind of arises out of an implicit agreement between individuals and the attempt to find sort of common ground, and that sort of attempt to govern by consent, by reaching a sort of agreement as much as possible, is sort of rejected as just sort of naive or just leading to the wrong answers, I guess, for them.
Well, I suppose the post-liberal, the hardcore authoritarian post-liberal would also say it's dishonest, because actually what liberal theory does, if you follow their argument back through to the communitarian challenge, they'll say, well, liberalism is itself a contested view. It's just one voice amongst many in this plural order they keep going on about. Why is it the right answer? It's dictating the terms for everybody else. Well, if it's a choice between liberal dictatorship and dictatorship, dictatorship is going to win. And that's kind of Schmitt's point. Democracy as it works in the modern world, parliamentarism and so on, is a kind of factional dictatorship. It just is.
And that sort of reveals
structure. Yeah.
And that
Then
sort of reveals
it's not
sort
a
of
good argument against dictatorship that it's illiberal. Of course it's illiberal. And somebody like Adrian Vermeulen is very, very strong to push back on this.
But that reveals a sort of anti-democratic strand in this thought, as well as sort of anti-liberal. It just says, well, this is already anti-democratic in a way, and so what's wrong with moving to this other anti-democratic kind of state of affairs?
Yeah. I mean, Schmitt's argument and those who follow him, so certainly somebody in the political post-liberal movement like Vermeulen would just say, democracy is one thing, liberal democracy is another. The liberal and democratic bit are incompatible, and liberalism is doing all the work.
Mm.
Democracy is the identification of rule and ruler. That's the sort of definition of it. It doesn't have to be accommodationist. So it's kind of populism, right? It's the people have their will, the ruler articulates that will and acts on it. And the will is just what it is. So there's no way of saying, yeah, but the people could do something really stupid, or is it really their will to act in, all the challenges that we throw back at populism, for this hard right tradition, say that's what democracy is really about. And you see some of that in the sort of national populist discourse. Think of
Mm.
MAGA, you think of Brexit. The problem with democracy is it's democratic until it isn't, till the people actually want something other than what the liberal elite say they should have. So there is a challenge there in terms of, who's deciding, what are they deciding on, and for whom. And that's where the authoritarianism comes in.
I want to get to some questions from the audience. I'll ask you very unfairly, if you can say in 5 minutes or so or less, what do we do about this? So how do liberals, or how does liberalism fight back against this movement? I think we discussed in private that there's a sort of probable sense that there's a lot of intellectual as well as political momentum behind this movement. Liberalism is seen as the status quo,
Mm.
and post-liberals as the insurgents. It's always harder defending the status quo than sort of an exciting new idea that perhaps hasn't been tried out yet and promises lots of exciting new things. So how do we negotiate this kind of competition between these two conceptions of the good in some way, the sort of
Mm.
more polite, thin, liberal one that says, okay, well, we need to allow for as much disagreement as possible, and then the post-liberal one that says, no, there will be one version of what the good is, and the state will impose it.
So I suppose, continuing the argument is the first thing that is important, to keep a broadly liberal project alive. And, here I'm going to help myself to Hannah Arendt's sort of idea of natality, the sort of rebirth and rediscovery of things. In each new generation, ideas are rediscovered in their own way. I don't want to sort of patronize by age somebody like Dan Chandler, but the way in which his most recent book has sort of recovered John Rawls for a new generation rather than people like me who read him 40 and a bit years ago in class, and he's a bit old hat. So it's about renewal, and
Mm.
renewal is is always done through reworking, rethinking ideas. And I think the right has done that, and this is partly where we've come to the recovery of people like Schmidt and traditionalist types of Catholic integralist thought. There's people who find that exciting and have brought it back. But of course, as it gets mainstreamed, it's going to be challenged and critiqued. And the basis of that is going to open up space for rethinking, fundamental ideas. And maybe we go round in some kind of ideological circle. But what we don't do is we don't close things down and admit defeat. So I think for those who are committed to a broadly liberal, egalitarian, democratic project, we've got to do some hard work and think about ways in which this can be made vibrant, interesting, and connected to the world that, the post-liberals will disappoint
Mm.
because it is factional.
Yeah. Well, it will only make certain people happy, and yeah, the
Yeah,
rest probably not. Okay, we've got quite a lot of questions, so I'd like to
yeah.
jump on that, and maybe we can run over by a few minutes so we can get as many as possible in. Dean Casal asks, um, as you spoke, I kept thinking of Dostoevsky's The Possessed. What distinguishes these post-liberals from intellectually energized anarchists? So,
Um, well, of course, they're the sort of complete opposite of these energized. I mean, it's a wonderful, way of framing this. And I suppose the post-liberals would like to see themselves as these sort of, leaders of change and challenge. And they are destroyers. I think that is something. This is not a sort of conservative recovery and maintenance of the status quo. These are reactionaries. So in some sense, that's a rather nice way of, framing the challenge. In some sense, they are like those figures who are out to, destroy things in order to bring about some change. So these sort of nihilist reactionaries, rather than, other kinds of anarchists.
Yeah, and as you say, yeah, these sort of there's a radical aspect to this movement
Yes.
because
Yeah.
the conservative status quo for them is just a sort of boring version of liberalism. It's just the
Yeah.
same with a
Yeah.
slightly different,
Yeah.
tie on or something.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
a good example of that would be the sort of Paul Ryan Republicans who've been repudiated, who were sort of, paid up, traditional Catholics who liked Ayn Rand, bonkers, but that was so
yeah.
it's dispensing with that.
Mm.
It's a radical challenge to the current world.
So Kevin Fraser asks a very interesting question around whether this kind of resurgence of communitarianism suggests that liberalism has failed to adequately address the deep human need for belonging and shared moral frameworks. And if that is true, is the solution to refine liberalism to incorporate stronger communal bonds?
Well, I mean, I think communal bonds are really, really important, and I think although my book is mischievously subtitled why faith, family, and flag is a dead end for the left, all of those things are important. Nobody thinks that family, faith in terms of some bigger set of values and so on are unimportant. But the question is whose and how important. So I think the idea that liberalism desiccates those sorts of sources of value is one, I think, actually overstated, and it doesn't have to, but equally, it needs to do some more clarification and thinking about ways in which these sources of value, the ways of living values in circumstances of pluralism, happen. The problem with the common good is it's great if it's yours, and it's not great if it's not yours. So, me growing up in a small, town in the south of England, knowing people who were different, running up against real communal boundaries. My parents were immigrants. I was brought up a Catholic in a world in which, you know, we were all Poles and Italians and Irish and, Germans, and there weren't any English ones, So
Mm.
community's fine, but it always is particular and it has a kind of history. So I think, the common good aspiration is great until it's not great.
Yeah.
And
That
that's the
speaks very
real,
much to our previous episode where we talked about ways of belonging and whether,
yeah,
forms of belonging always need to be exclusionary in ways that,
yeah,
essentially hurt other people.
yes. I think family is really, really important, but does that rule out same-sex families? I actually don't think it does, but a
Mm.
lot of people do. They're not really families, and they're so, all of these kind of genuine challenges about living values collectively and reciprocally kind of create a problem when they confront diversity. Now, of course, there's always boundaries about what's going to be allowed and what isn't, who decides those, and under what terms, and is that done, broadly, comprehensively? Well, if that's true, you're a liberal, or narrowly and specifically, then you're not.
There's an interesting question that comes next by an anonymous person. says these traditional theories, even if slightly rearranged, feel somewhat inadequate to address the extreme inequality in many countries, and especially the concept of corporations or as full persons in the context of the United States. How do these theories address the resource guarding this extreme wealth represents? So we talked a little bit about how there is a critique of corporations and neoliberalism from the post-liberal right and obviously from the left to some extent. Do they offer an answer to the kind of big issues around wealth inequality?
Well, I suppose my critical take on on post-liberalism, particularly for those who try and make this a sort of ethical socialist agenda, is that they don't have a way of dealing with egregious inequalities. And I think this is something. I mean, you can argue, is Rawls' difference principle adequate? But at least recognizing that some conception of egalitarianism has to be central to thinking about what a good polity can be. And of course, as your question is probably suggesting, when you look at this at the global level, you know, states in terms of how they organize themselves, internally, but also one with another, can't be indifferent to the way in which, material inequality has exponentially grown over the last 40 years as a result of, it was always bad, but it's just massively increased under neoliberalism. Do we do anything about that? It's not straightforward. It's not easy. But of course, there's lots of thinking going on about this. Thomas Piketty, lots of theorists of, the economics of equality and how this is important for sustaining fair or just or stable political order, brings us back to this kind of idea of controlling, thinking about, how we regulate, a fairer global distribution of wealth. And I don't see any of that in the post-liberal agenda, despite what people like Sohrab Ahmari are genuinely trying to do. I don't see any of that there.
And do you think, I mean, this is now maybe digressing a little bit, but the difference, but you mentioned the difference principle, and just to remind people that in the context of Rawls' theory of justice, that means that inequalities, material inequalities are allowed to the extent that they end up benefiting the poorest or the kind of
Worst
the less,
off representative figure in a
the
society.
worst.
So
Yeah.
that the advantage of the worst off. Yeah.
Yeah. And in some ways, New Labour, I think, sort of trying to sort of embody that, right? And there's that famous quote, "We don't mind you getting filthy rich as long as you pay your taxes," thinking, well, you'll pay your taxes, and so everyone will, benefit to some extent from that. But is there perhaps space to sort of recognize that even if there are material benefits here and there, there's sort of a sort of corrosive aspect of inequality to the extent that we're witnessing it now, that even that difference principle isn't quite enough.
Well, I suppose that's why I talk about the most egregious inequalities. Even if you go back, so even if you think of the US Constitution through the eyes of the Federalists, they thought that the sorts of inequalities that we now see with figures like Musk render the whole thing unsustainable.
Yeah.
And if somebody can basically buy a political system, then all bets are off for everything. You've got a king. So it's those sort of distorting inequalities that we need to think about and how you address those. Okay. Now, state architecture can do it if there's a political will. It needs a reason to justify it. It needs to address those who say, oh no, leave everything. The system as a whole is to the benefit of us all, the kind of Hayek argument, and say, no, actually, we don't need those most egregious inequalities. And they're also subverting the values and position that we all really need to lead minimally decent lives. So, maybe Rawls didn't give us the right answer to the question, but he asked the right question. And then the task is going to be rethinking that. And I think that's the sort of debate that people like economists like Thomas Piketty and others, Tony Atkinson at LSE in Oxford, have tried to do in terms of their role as economists. There's a task for political theorists and political philosophers to take up that agenda. And it has to be a realistic task rather than my Marxist friends who just say, yeah, well, what we've got to do is overthrow capitalism. One, that's not easy. Two, we haven't managed to do it just yet. And the two really big attempts to overthrow capitalism have only made capitalism stronger. So I think, we can sort of leave it to history to work out, or we can try and do something, to sort of address some of these in terms of regulation and so on. That's the sort of liberal space, I think.
You mentioned Musk in your reply, and Anthony Morgan, who was our editor for many years and now is one of the managing editors of The Philosopher, asks, this vision of post-liberalism doesn't sound as dangerous or quite dangerous enough, especially in the context of the US politics. What about Musk-inspired cyber-libertarianism, etc., which clearly has some place in this table? Is this a coherent political philosophy, post-liberal or otherwise? You do touch on Musk in your book. You say that basically Trump does have, the Trump administration has a kind of competing conceptions of the good within it, and Musk represents one side, and then this J D Vance sort of side represents the other. So do you think maybe, we've been focusing on the less dangerous one, is the Musk cyber libertarian techno futuristic whatever, potentially more dangerous?
Potentially. And there is a kind of common connection, in somebody like Peter Thiel, who was an associate of Musk, business associate and so on, but also a kind of patron of the sort of Vance type post-liberalism. These people are out there, and of course, crudely, the thing that Trump likes to do is to play off factions, and it's a bit like the TV show, you play off and then you pick the winner. It's quite possible that, Musk wins out. I doubt it, though. I think in the end, there's possibly greater room for the Vance type extreme populist authoritarianism to take hold, and that will have lots of bearing on, whether, Greenland stays part of Denmark or joins the United, but lots of other really important things. And I think Musk will be displaced because in the end, that model of politics is parasitic on effective state economies. I don't want to go into, who Musk is and what his wealth based on and so on and so forth. But they all went for this model of politics, all the big tech, because they didn't want regulation. There's a fairly easy explanation of why they've all gone where they have and why they're spending all their money for a certain kind of politics, because they don't want European Union or China or whatever regulating out their wealth. So, there's something fragile about their dominance. I don't think, the Curtis Yarvin idea of these techno, corporations displacing the state. I mean, it's easy to type stuff on your laptop in your darkness of your room and predict the future. The real challenge, I think, is the change of the terms of political discourse. And I see some of that more strongly with somebody like Vance. Now, he could also blow up. Trump could chop his legs off and so on. But that movement, may, reproduce itself, and colonize the, political right in the US and therefore elsewhere, because people.
And in some ways it has already, right? I mean, Hungary is a sort of like almost model for a lot of post-liberals think the state should look like. There are more questions. I'm going to start editing, having an editorial and sort of selecting some that just grab me. Tom Iopolo asks, how would the post-liberals criticize Rawls as starting points that we should design a just society behind a veil of ignorance? And what would they say that this would be the best way to structure society as fair and just to everyone? How would they dismiss this kind of technique and say, well, you now, given that you are Catholic, you have these views about the world, you think we should all live, but what if you didn't know, that you were situated in this sort of social context? How would you choose? Would you choose your common good view of the world then?
Um,
How would they reply?
well, I suppose the post-liberal response is to just dispense with the choice. So, the common good, all common good theorists think that some conception of the common good can emerge out of political interaction. Okay, that's just what happens. Or, the national populists think that there just is a set of values that we, the people, hold. Okay, and they may not be liberal values, but they are our values. Now, of course, the challenge is that there isn't that set of widely shared values. That's the one thing we know about. That's the bit that political science gives us. There might be a governing elite, but there isn't a mass. The mass is constituted by elites and so on. So the real challenge is going to be, those who think that they don't have to justify themselves to others on reasonable terms, and the task is to impose a conception of the good, and whether that acquires popular legitimacy or not. It might be that's actually quite easy, and people find that they're much less scared of strongman leadership, and their commitment to democracy is a hell of a lot weaker than they think it is. But of
Mm,
course, once they've given up those, and then they suddenly realize actually they did want it. But the shift to authoritarianism is probably not that hard in the right kind of circumstances. And I think the US is providing us with a kind of test case of that. So I think that's where this goes. It
mm.
isn't that we do another kind of rules test. We either buy into the idea of seeking some reasonable terms of cooperation between people who disagree about fundamental ends, or we just say all that noise, that parliamentarism, that squabbling over factional values. It just needs a strong leader to impose order. That's Book 8 of Plato's Republic. That's current United States. That's kind of what Schmidt hoped would happen at the end of the Weimar Republic. But unfortunately, he got Hitler. But he did want, a strong executive president who'd unleash the army on all these factions and bring about order, if necessary, at the point of a bayonet or a gun.
Mm.
But they didn't. They did something else. So whoever makes the choice, and that's the risk that we face with this sort of authoritarianism. You have to trust the leader to give you what you want. And they always give you what you want. You just don't realize that you wanted it. But they say, no, that's what you wanted. And that's the problem with this other model of politics. It works until it doesn't.
Okay, I'll ask one final question before we wrap up. I see our audience is still holding strong in the participation, but we should be wrapping up. Um, Susan Clark says, well, this conversation sounds quite sort of Eurocentric, male-centric. It's sort of like it doesn't include other concerns that are floating in the ether at the moment, concerns around sustainability, climate change, women inclusivity, inclusivity of other traditions of thought, Eastern, Southern, and so on. Is there a way, can we sort of inject some more energy perhaps in the sort of debate and kind of on the other side of the post-liberal camp by injecting some energy from other traditions and not just going back to kind of the old liberal kind of principles and trying to kind of make the arguments again? Can we do something that is a bit more new and includes some of these other, traditions of thought? I'm sort of slightly paraphrasing now the question, but
Yeah, I mean, I hear what Susan is saying, and there's a lot in that, and I suppose the just to pick one angle, this sort of very gendered conversation we've been having is because the post-liberal tradition just doesn't have any women. I mean, perhaps it's also linked with an agenda of rolling back the emancipation of women, Equal Rights Amendment and all those sorts of things, to say nothing about Roe versus Wade and women's control over themselves and so on. All of that is out of the story. So, to say, well, where is this? Could we bring that back in? Well, yeah, I hope so. But how you bring it back in is important. If you just bring it back in a discourse that doesn't engage with an opponent, you're just having another conversation elsewhere. And that idea of political engagement and the space in which it happens, I suppose, is what I'm kind of crassly calling the liberal space. But it's a place where these ideas come back in, or where those sorts of voices are protected, because it isn't for those cancelling discourses to have a dominant say. All right, so citizen rights and so on. Now, without that, yeah, there's movement politics, there's taking to the streets, there's all sorts of things. But that's not terrible. Kind of recent history shows this is not a good way of advancing a broadening, more emancipatory politics. I'm sympathetic to that, but I'm kind of stuck with who are the opponents to it. And I think, for too long, in the academy, it's been very easy to say, liberalism exhausts the terrain of discourse and we need to emancipate it and, bring in other voices and all the rest of it. Easy to do in a classroom, I can tell you. Great, easy to do in the classroom. Not quite so easy to do it on the streets, not quite so easy to do it in politics, unless you have power. Then you can emancipate, liberate, restructure political institutions. But it's the age-old problem that, people are always disappointed by, the sort of moderately, reformist politics we have, and they want something more radical, but they haven't got it. And that's the challenge. I would like to see, for my own grandchildren's sake, hugely more emphasis placed on sustainability, the climate, and the challenges that go with that. I think that's kind of my obligation to that generation to make that space. But when you look at our normal politics, and I'm afraid that's true everywhere, with the possible exception of communist China, which does take these things seriously in a way we don't, there isn't a space for this. The West is retreating from it. Popular politics is kind of betraying. Social media is just jammed with critiques of net zero, and so getting that voice, is to the right place where it can do something is important.